Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. This is the last lecture on culture. We had 21 points of differences that we had observed between myself, or us, and our students coming from different cultures. And these 21 differences made it effective or ineffective without knowing these differences in communication. And if we could be aware of these differences, then we could accommodate for them and possibly achieve a higher level of education, a higher level of comprehension, and just be a more effective process. In this lecture, we're going over the last 3 of those 21. We're going over number 19, which is the description of faith. Description of faith. Description of faith follows much of the other points in that the Western world tends to be an internal world with auditory processing. The world tends to be in the mind, and it tends to be idealistic. It tends to think and imagine within the mind. So how do we describe faith? How would a Westerner describe his faith? How would I describe my faith? Well, if I was asked to describe my faith, I would probably ask for pencil and paper. And I would write it out. And that writing would include a lot of descriptions, descriptive nouns and adjectives. And I would go point by point, probably giving the different points of my faith and what I believed, and like I said, writing them out. And so it would just be a cognitive, it would be a descriptive, it would be a written, it would be an academic, it would be a reasonable type of exercising of the description of my faith. Whereas on the non-Western, if we were to ask, please give us a description of your faith, one, it probably would not be done on paper, nor with pencil. It would be demonstrated. It would be in action. It would be by verbs. If it was written at all, it would be with verbs and dynamic nouns. But more likely it would be described through movement. It would be described through actions. It would be described. So the description of our faith follows pretty much our tendency of how we express ourselves. And so I express myself a lot through, I would say maybe through what I read, through what I write, and through what I've developed for lecture content. That would probably be more of my expression, which might be more verbs or more nouns and adjectives than verbs. So we can kind of tell is that a student of ours that comes in that is more non-Western is going to want to or need to express himself through movement, through actions, through probably not so much through writing, probably not so much through tests, evaluating, written, but something that is through experience. Number 20, the use of knowledge. Okay, why am I putting my knowledge or my experience, documenting it on video? What do I want my viewers to do with it? Well, my desire is that the viewers can connect with it and apply it through their own relationships with others. That might be international, might be intercultural, it might be in whatever. So my desire is not really personal achievement, but why are you watching the video? What is your, or the lecture, what is your motive for doing it? Is it personal achievement? Is it just to grow personally in your knowledge, and in your expand your knowledge level. Where on this side, it's not personal achievement that somebody would be watching the video series. Usually for non-Western, it would be to learn something because one, they were sent to watch it, they were told to watch it, and they're going to learn something from it for the good of that community. And so it'd be for the common good of those involved. So that the motivation for our studying is determined also by our cultural background and where we come from. So in other words, the students in my class, why are they there and what motivates them? Most of them were not motivated by competition. They were not motivated by grades and getting different grades by performing at different levels. Their knowledge, they came or they were sent to class because their parents wanted them to be professional, to have a degree. And so their use of their knowledge is to go back and is to help the family become more successful in their business adventures or in their work. Whereas on this side, our studies, our academic achievements, my academic achievement is personal. I was not sent to college. I went. I chose to go. I studied what I wanted to. And after studying what I wanted to, I did what I wanted to do with the studies and never really consulted with an outside authority of what I should study, what should I do, and what should I do with it when I'm done. That is not part of my cultural upbringing, but I can see that now very clearly in a non-Western tendency. The use of the knowledge is for common good. And why are they there in my class? Mostly because their parents or local authorities sent them, that they wanted them to get a degree to be able to come back and to be able to help their community. Differences in motivation. Difference in motivation of why our students are there and how do we motivate them to reach the highest level that they can depends on their reason for being there. Last point. Point number 21. It's an interesting point. Well, I think they all are. Otherwise, I wouldn't have noted them down and made you sit through them. But number 21 is the axis of these cultures. Now, I'm going to have to get out of the way so that you can see the whole board, but I'll do that towards the end so that you can see what we've put together. The axis, what does that mean? The axis is something that is dominant in that culture, an attitude that motivates that culture to do what it does. An axis is what is the main pivot point of that culture and one of the most important things to the culture. Now, all three, I've divided up into three cultures. So what we've got is the Western, the non-Western, and the Midwestern, or the mid-non-Western. It could go either way. So there's three types of cultures of motivation that we have seen out there. And what this does is that it communicates what's important to them and to me. And so going into a situation is to understand what is the real motivating factor, what is one of their most important motivators within their culture. And for me and for this, I grew up the Western tendency, the motivating factor is the law. And being under the law, is innocent or guilty, is what is very important. And so we spend a lot of our time declaring our innocence and of trying to act innocent or trying to act in a way that would not make us guilty. And that is growing up. We were taught that we followed the rules, and we followed the laws of the land, and that it was important to do so. At one point in my career of work, I worked early mornings, and I delivered papers commercially, newspaper commercially. The guy that showed me the route, we drove the wrong way at 2 a.m. in the morning on a 4-lane boulevard. We were on the wrong side of the divider, going the wrong way. But it was the easiest way to get the job done because there wasn't any cars on the road at that time, and we did it. But I was convicted. It was really hard for me to even do that because it didn't matter if there was cars or no cars on the road. You don't do that. You don't go against the law of the land. And now if you even look at religiously, we tend to focus on creeds and doctrines, and maybe a Western church tends to be more legalistic, and because it's legal. And so we tend to complete the law. We are law-abiding, and so we transfer that over to the spiritual world, and our level or maturity of spirit or closeness to God is gauged by how good we've done or how well we've been, and whether we feel innocent or guilty within that context. And so we measure things. In our culture, law and order is very important. For those of you that have been to other cultures, you know that law and order is not always that important. Non-Western culture, what is more important? Is it the law? No, not really. So what is it? Well, what's really important in a rural culture that is really isolated, that is out there, kind of like in the Amazon basin area where we've been, it's called the non-Western tendency of the axis is a power. They live in a world of powers that they don't have. Most of them do not have. And so they live in fear of powers, spiritual powers that they might have offended, or they might have transgressed something, and so they live in fear of retribution of this power. And so therefore they are a very spiritually based people, and they comply with offerings and sacrifices and doing a lot of things before planting, before harvesting, before cutting trees down, before building a house, before they are very conscious of power and of offending it. And so what they look for is peace versus fear. And so their axis of their world is not based on law and order, not based on innocent or guilty, but it's based on power and who has it, and what must I do to be at peace with that power. So that is a full non-Western, extreme non-Western. But in the middle, get off to the side here, in the middle we have I'll say a Midwestern tendency. What it is a tendency that we often find outside of the rural setting, but from the rural setting to the suburban areas is a Midwestern tendency that it's of relationships. And so relationships are what is most important. And it's honor versus shame. And so it's the law is not as important, and power, they're kind of removed from that culture of power. So what is most important to them is maintaining relationships, and honor versus shame. Being honored in a relationship or honoring relationships, that is what is important, and not shaming them. And I have one experience, I have many, but one experience that I would like to just share is my first month or 2 months in when we got to Bolivia. We were in Bolivia 25 years. And so within my first few months of Bolivia, I was learning a lot. But I was a very good Westerner. And we lived in the city of La Paz, which is in a crater, a washed out, dug out by massive amounts of water crater. And the crater walls were vertical on the edges, and then it went down. And so we lived kind of up on one of the walls, towards up one of the walls. And so going down to the city, or we were in the city, but going down to the main boulevard was kind of like San Francisco. And the streets went down, and then you would cross, then there would be a cross street where it would be leveled out, and then you go down again. And so it was very hilly and very steep. And they had stoplights at each intersection of where there was a crossroad, and you're coming down it. The interesting part was the stoplights were manually run. There was a policeman that stood there and clicked it from green to yellow to red, and then back to green again. So it was manual. And I was coming down the hill from our house, coming to the stoplight, and I was slowing down, but was not. It was green, and right when I got to it, it went red. And I went through a red light. And so the policeman blew his whistle. And me being a good Westerner, I stopped because the policeman blew his whistle. And so I stopped complying with the authority of the police. And he came up to my vehicle and he said, "You went through a red light." And he said, "Here in Bolivia, that is an infraction." And I said, "Well, I guess I did go through. That is true. I went through a red light, but you skipped yellow." And he kind of smiles. He says, "You went through a red light." And he says, "We can fix this here." And I, being an upright, Western, law-abiding citizen, I'm not going to fix this on the street. If I've done something wrong, give me the ticket. Give me the infraction. And he says, "You sure?" And I said, "Yeah, that's how I want to do it. I don't, want to pay money out for something that, if I did something wrong, I want to make it right." And he says, "Okay." So he wrote out the ticket, gave me the ticket. And when you get a ticket there, you've got 24 hours to present yourself at the police station and fix whatever you did wrong. So I went down to the police station 2 hours later because it was lunchtime. So I went after lunch and went to the police station and went up to the captain. He was up at his desk like a judge, and I handed him the ticket. And he looks at it and he says, "All right, section number, ... And the policeman on the street just wrote, in section numbers of violations. It wasn't written out what I did. And so the policeman, the captain says, "How do you want to pay for this?" And I said, "What are my options?" And he says, "Well, 2 nights in jail." And I kind of like, "What? 2 nights in jail?" And he says, "Well, yes, sir." He says, "Drunk driving here is a serious infraction." And I said, "Drunk driving?" And he says, "Yes, that's what you've been written up for. And that's what the code says, and that's what I have to charge you with." And he says, and I said, "I wasn't drunk driving. I said I went through a red light because he skipped yellow." And the captain kind of looks at me and he says, "Well, how long ago was that?" "That was 2 hours ago." "You don't look drunk." "Okay." He says, "We can fix this." I'm like, "I've heard this before." "Okay." And he says, let's fix this. And he says, "We need paint to paint the front of our police station here, the doors and stuff. You don't have to paint it. Just if you would go and get us the paint, go to the hardware store and buy us 1 gallon of black and 1 gallon of white. And if you would buy those paints, then we'll settle." And I said, "Okay." And so I went and I bought 2 gallons of paint, came back, put them up on his desk, and he took my ticket and ripped it up. Okay, what did I learn? Well, I learned that I was law-driven and they were relational. Why relational? Well, it's because they were ashamed of the peeling paint on their police station. So if I would be kind enough to buy them the paint, then they would scrape it and paint it, and they would have a better looking front door. Okay? So it'd be to honor them and to honor their society. And so what happened with the policeman on the street? What happened there? It was lunchtime. And he was probably hungry. And so what he was asking for was something to eat. If I would have had a sandwich probably, or an apple, he would have said thank you, and I'd have been gone. But instead, because of my Western of, if I'm wrong, then give me the ticket and I'll pay it, he's kind of like, all right, we could settle it here, or you can settle it there. So either way, I learned that it's not necessarily corruption, but it's maybe necessity that they use a law to help out a relationship. And because I had a car, that means I probably had resources that could help him out too. So that was my experience within the first 2 months. And I was starting to learn now how my Western concept of law and was being challenged, and that I was now in another culture that ran on different rules, different thought patterns, and those were patterns that I needed to pick up real quickly. Otherwise, I was going to be paying out a lot. So anyway, that wraps it up for the 21 differences, cognitive thinking differences that can influence our patterns of perceptions, how we see the world, how we act, and how we move in it. And those 21 differences will influence what happens in the classroom, will influence what happens in a business meeting, will influence what happens in a neighborhood, in social relationships. Thank you for allowing me to share these. What we're going to do is take these cultural differences now and use them as factors in building what would be the next phase of a worldview. And then taking that worldview that is based on culture, worldview, and then looking at our concept of origins, looking at science and how we can understand the different models, different scientific models of science based on culture and worldview, and how to understand, based on what Stephen Jay Gould had mentioned in the beginning, is that the 4 factors that influence our understanding or our perceptions of the facts is theory, habit, prejudice, and culture. Thanks for listening. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. Again, that's our contact information if you'd like to get in touch with us. Thanks for listening.